In 1933, the world of cinema would forever be changed with the release of RKO's smash hit, King Kong. A film that took people out of the Great Depression and into a prehistoric world of savage tribesmen and dinosaurs ruled by the titular ape himself. This film would captivate the imagination of those who saw it and influence the creation of other giant monsters to varying degrees, and would set new standards in the filmmaking industry as a whole, becoming one of the most famous monsters in fiction and forever marking his name in pop culture. Too bad the same thing can't be said about the rest of his films.
Did he just say, aye, he did?
Now, don't get me wrong, I like Kong, and I have a lot of respect for the character, but this was an honestly hard list to make. I mean, sure, when compared to other franchises in the trinity of giant movie monsters, his filmography is only about as big as Gamera's. But while the latter easily has the most bad movies, and Godzilla probably has the worst movies, Kong has the most sporadic movies. Simply because he's got it all. The groundbreaking original, direct-to-video cash grabs, sequels, reboots, crossovers, you name it. But while his franchise has mostly been hit or miss, Kong has had some genuine gems over the years. So to celebrate the upcoming Skull Island Netflix series and King Kong's next big screen adventure, we'll be taking a look at all 12 of the current King Kong movies to see which ones truly stand on top of the world and which ones have rightfully fallen to the streets below. With that said, I'm One Fish Mob, and today we're looking at every King Kong movie from worst to best. Gee, the one movie that's almost unanimously agreed to be the worst one of them all is at the bottom of this list?
Coincidence? I think not!
But seriously, this movie was an absolute train wreck. This movie was such a bomb at the box office and was thrashed by critics so thoroughly that it almost killed the King Kong franchise as a whole. And it's really no secret as to why. There is just so much wrong with it that I could honestly fill out an entire video essay as to why this movie sucks so much. The story is just really dumb and not in a self-aware or so bad it's good sort of way, and it can get really cringy at times, especially with how it tries to parallel the love stories of the humans and Kongs to no meaningful effect. What should be dramatic honestly comes off as really cheesy, and not in a fun way either, and any attempt at comedy just really falls flat, and just feels really out of place in this film. But the biggest problem is that there's almost no plot outside of the superficial concept. We just mostly sit around as the Kongs do really nothing but vibe for almost an hour or so, with the occasional action scene thrown in. Me and my mom watched this movie, and she was worried it'd be about Lady Kong falling in love with a human who exploits her. Something that I actually wished happened, because it honestly would have been a lot more interesting than the film we got. Not to mention, it would have been more thematically fitting with the theme of the last movie, and could give Kong a more compelling story arc of preventing the same thing that happened to him from happening to her. But as is, it's about as much fun as watching paint dry. And the whole plot is just a mess, and raises a lot of questions with none of them ever being answered. Why did they keep Kong alive? Didn't he destroy half of New York in the last film? Why are they trying to kill something they spent millions on keeping alive? Why don't they just return them to the jungle and study them there instead of making a sanctuary for them? Why is that snake so huge compared to the people Kong holds in his hand? Why is it called King Kong Lives if he ends up dying in the end? That's not a spoiler. That's how almost all of these movies end. Why not call it King Kong Escapes? Hell, where is Jack Prescott and Dwan in all of this? They're the main characters of the last film. I'd think the two people who had the most empathy and care for Kong would at least be there for his life-saving surgery or supervise the construction of their sanctuary.
I have so many questions!
And really, that's just scratching the surface of this movie. But let's move on to the most infamous part of this movie: the special effects. Compared to all the other movies on this list, the special effects here are easily the worst. You can tell what's a doll, the blue screen is horrific, the arm extensions are way too obvious. These effects are truly laughable. Watching this back to back with the previous movie, going from the talent of a Rick Baker to this, is not an easy transition. Which is honestly kind of shocking because the guy they got, Carlo Rambaldi, has a pretty good track record. This guy did the effects for Dune, White Buffalo, Alien, and E.T., just to name a few. Now, I'm not going to call these effects groundbreaking, but they're definitely really good, and some of these hold up even to this day. So you'd think, at the bare minimum, that this movie would look half as decent as any of those films. I've seen more convincing gorilla costumes from a Halloween store. Sure, the Toho movies probably have worse looking special effects, but that can be chalked up to the time period those movies were made in more than the special effects themselves. But to be fair, the costumes here are not as bad as the Toho suits. That's kind of sad if I'm being honest. But the one part I am the most conflicted about with this movie is the inclusion of a female Kong. Because on one hand, there is some potential here. Most interpretations of King Kong have him as the sole surviving member of his species, so it can potentially be interesting to see him interact with another Kong, especially since Anne or Dwan would never work out for obvious reasons. And, to their credit, they at least try to develop a relationship between the two Kongs as opposed to just making it a love at first sight like a lot of other movies tend to do. Sure, there are some elements of that, but at least the two Kongs spend time with each other to actually get to know one another. But at the same time, it results in this very boring love story between the two that makes me roll my eyes at it a lot more than actually feel for it. But if I am being totally fair towards this movie, there are some things I enjoyed in it. The scenes where King Kong and Lady Kong are actually doing stuff that isn't romantic is honestly where the movie becomes a lot more bearable and even somewhat entertaining. It reminds me a lot of the older Godzilla movies, in a good way. Sometimes the special effects were so bad it was actually hilarious, particularly the scene where he eats a guy.
Comedy gold.
And the final battle is honestly the best scene in the movie, and probably the most cathartic, with King Kong defeating the military instead of losing to it. And the one scene that almost works is where King Kong is dying, and he gets to see his son before he passes away. This is a genuinely nice, heartfelt scene. I felt something when I saw this. I wasn't going to cry, but I felt something. But aside from this scene, the rest of the movie is just so much of a slog to sit through that I honestly don't know who I would recommend this to. It's too slow and void of anything for people who enjoys older monster movies with a fast pace. And it's too cheesy and not well made for people who want a true epic. In the end, I guess if you set the bar real low, this could work as a movie you put on for you and your friends to riff on, MST3K style. It's as my mom said, it's a true can of misery.
And you can quote me on that.
But other than that, this is, without a doubt, the worst King Kong movie, by a landslide. And no, I am not joking. This movie, as of this video's upload, is currently in the running for being labeled as one of the worst movies ever made. Which, given the already extensive list of movies with that title already, is saying a lot.
The first thing we're gonna do tonight is shut off this cockamamie music!
In this direct-to-video adventure brought to you by Warner Brothers, The Mighty Kong retells the story of the original movie, but with a musical twist, and, as stated in its own advertising, is a film that was made to cash in on the 1998 remakes of Godzilla and Mighty Joe Young. And let me tell you, I hate this movie. Now don't get me wrong, I knew this was not going to be good going into it, but man, while all the criticism it gets is warranted, the reason why I don't like it is because of how generic it is. Simply put, this is the original King Kong, but worse in every conceivable way. But we'll discuss that more as we get into the meat of this. Right off the bat, this is the first animated movie King Kong ever had, and is currently the first of 3 animated movies based on the big guy. And apparently, this was animated by 2 unnamed studios. One animated the majority of the movie and where the film looks the cheapest, with a lot of reused footage and weird edits, while the intro and the rampage sequences were animated by another studio, and is honestly the only time the animation looks pretty decent. That's all I have to say about it. It's just what's honestly expected from direct-to-video. Which is a stark contrast to one of my bigger gripes with this movie. They water down the story of the original movie so much, it turns what was once one of the most influential and, dare I say it, important films ever made into an overglorified Saturday morning cartoon in an attempt to make it family friendly. But even by the standards of the 1990s, I don't see what made the original film not suitable for kids. I mean, given the stuff we'd see in movies that came out in the following decades after the original film, and now that horror titles such as Five Nights at Freddy's are enjoyed by a lot of children, I doubt it'd be any less suitable for them than most other movies that have come out before or since, especially now. And while stuff like the jaw rip might be graphic, I don't think it's any more graphic than Kong ripping the guts out of a skull crawler, or decapitating another monster and drinking its blood. So once again, what's the point? What's the point in making this? And what they do to make it family friendly is really stupid. When the Mighty Kong destroys the plane sent after him, they try to catch him with blimps and a net. Why? Why not just drop the net on top of him? In the original movie, they bring him to New York to profit off of him. Here, they bring him back because they want to save him, for no real reason other than we have to keep this family friendly. Only Denham has a reason to bring him back. In fact, Denham himself has no real character in this film. He is the only main character with no story arc. I cannot say he is the devious but ambitious man like in the 2005 film, because he himself does plan on giving Mighty Kong a good life any way he can. Nor can I say he is a down-on-his-luck director looking for his big break, because he is already a well-respected director who chooses to close his own show down to move on to bigger and better things. The movie also takes its sweet time focusing on the voyage to Skull Island rather than the actual adventure on it. And that voyage takes up a majority of the movie, and only exists to pad out the runtime. They remove the foreboding nature and grand scale of the original and replace it with slapstick comedy that is not funny, and a Chim Chim and Spritle duo who add nothing to the story and could just be written out altogether. When watching this, I was afraid they were going to be the unfunny comic relief that makes everything worse, like High Five in the Emoji Movie, or Elliot in Open Season. But I actually wish they were, because at least they'd be adding something to the story, even if it's setting the characters back. As is, they just exist. And when it's not these two, the whole cast of characters are just watered down versions of their original portrayals. The same goes for the Mighty Kong, because they spend so much time on this boring boat, all the time to show us Kong is not a monster and the budding friendship between him and Anne is extremely rushed and feels more paint by numbers than anything. And may I remind you, we don't actually get to the Mighty Kong until the last 28 minutes. If we were to edit everything out and keep Mighty Kong's screen time, its runtime would only be 18 minutes out of this 70-minute feature. As a result, the two becoming friends instantly feels really forced, and we're just supposed to believe it despite being given no reasons to do so. But hey, at least their rushed friendship is more believable than Anne and Jack's romance. But let's get to the main draw of the movie. This is a musical with songs sung by the Little Mermaid herself, Jodi Benson. And if I am being honest, they are pretty mediocre. Not saying that they're bad, it's just that they're not bad enough to be criticized, nor are they good enough to be enjoyed. But with that said, is there anything good about this movie? Well, I kind of enjoyed the rampage scene. It kind of makes this movie a little bit better, especially since it's one of the few moments this movie's animation gets an odd quality boost. The intro is honestly a really good setup for the movie, even if the tone it sets clashes heavily with the rest of this lighthearted movie. The song sung by Anne at the theater is honestly the best in the movie. The dancing lobsters are cute, I guess. I think the Mighty Kong's design is good, but there's nothing that stands out about it either. Oh, I like the poster from 1997 used to advertise the film, and I like how the promotional pamphlet is designed to make it look like Mighty Kong is holding it. Look, I'm grasping at straws here. It's as I said many times before, it's just the first movie, but worse. I just wish there was a much better word to describe this movie. Hold on, give me a second. Yeah, that works. It's just a pointless, hollow, generic, vapid, watered-down bastardization of a much better movie you and your kids could be watching instead. Maybe if you're really curious, then it might be worth tracking down. But out of all the King Kong movies, this one is probably the only one I can truly call pointless. And now that the Broadway musical exists, it only hammers that point in and makes this look far worse by comparison. Not many people know this film exists, and let's be honest, you probably didn't either until watching this video. The Mighty Kong is a bad movie. Not the worst, just a normal, bad movie that left a really, really sour taste in my mouth. Moving on.
It wasn't the fall that killed Kong. It was beauty that killed the beast.
That's Bolshevik.
I'm the baby, gotta love me. Big purple eyes, I'm very cuddly.
Before we proceed, I just wanted to mention how we're not even halfway through the list, and I already have 2 new contenders for my personal worst movies list. So this has already been a really wild ride, despite us barely even getting started. Welp, here's hoping the next one isn't as bad.
Son of a bitch!
Okay, if I am being completely honest, out of the entire unholy trinity of what's considered to be the worst King Kong movies, this is the least terrible. With that said, it's still a mediocre movie. I already talked about it on my Movie Pond Reviews series, but I think I was a little bit too mean towards it the first time around. And now that I've seen some of the other monstrosities this franchise has spawned, I'm a bit more lenient towards it. For a rushed cash grab with half the budget and less than a quarter of the production time of the original, it's honestly pretty impressive that it's as watchable as it is. And I'll give it credit that what it does right is done pretty well. The story itself actually feels like a natural continuation of the story of King Kong, with Denham in trouble for Kong's rampage and now having to find a way to pay off his mounting debt. And I do think Hellstrom is a passable villain, and the very few new creatures we do see on Skull Island are pretty cool, I guess. But you can really tell where the corners were cut, with the most obvious being the plot. It's mostly just watching the human characters just sit around, talk, go somewhere, sit around, talk, go somewhere, sit around, talk, go somewhere, for 2/3 of the runtime. That's a lot of nothing going on. The actual conflict of them going to Skull Island doesn't start until halfway through the movie. And by the time we do get to the island, the movie only has around a half hour left. Heck, we don't actually get to see Kiko, yes, that's his official name, until the last 20 minutes or so. And yes, I know the original and all of its retellings have a long build up to Skull Island as well, but at least that's used to establish the characters and to build up the island's reveal. But here, it's entirely spent on watching the characters going around and doing nothing. And at least with the other movies on this list, the adventure itself is a majority of their runtime. Speaking of which, when we do get to it, Skull Island doesn't have that grand feel it did in the first film. Skull Island no longer has that grand feel it had. When I think of the original, I think of wide thickets of jungle, cliff sides, and canyons. But here, we're just boxed into a place that doesn't feel like a real jungle. And while that final 20 minutes is definitely better than the previous 40, because it has so little time to do anything, it forces as much conflict as possible into this short time frame. A giant bear, a dinosaur, and even the island sinking. All of which has no dramatic weight to it because it's just going through the motions at this point. And I still think the island being destroyed with no explanation is really dumb. Especially when you realize they were planning on making a lot more sequels to follow up on this.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
Yes, you heard me right. They had a lot of plans for the big guy. From fighting monsters in Malaysia, meeting Abbott and Costello, fighting the Frankenstein monster, and even a movie that would have pitted King Kong against the Lord of the Apes himself, Tarzan. Now, I know very well that none of these ever came to fruition, but regardless, sinking the island was really counterintuitive if that was the intention. But let's get to the star himself, the Son of Kong. While Kiko is cute and his interactions with the main characters are charming, his appearance does not save this movie, and really just exists to be the deus ex machina that the characters use on their treasure hunt. Maybe if they focused more on the connection between a semi-remorseful Denham and Kiko and fleshed that out more, it could have been more interesting. But they don't. I wish I could say more about this movie, but since practically nothing happens, there's just nothing more to talk about. Yes, it's not that good. Yes, I still say it stands up there with the bottom 2 movies on this list. But if it had been given more production time, this could have been a worthy follow-up. At least this movie had the potential to be something great. And that's more than what can be said about these abominations. That's for sure. To summarize, while it may be better than the former, I still say just stick with the Kong of Skull Island series and When King Kong Fell, as they are just better follow-ups to the original movie in general.
Under the sea. Under the sea.
Just going back to my Movie Pond review of Son of Kong real quick, I would like to formally renounce my declaration of Son of Kong being the most forgettable King Kong movie ever made. Why? Because that declaration fits Kong, King of Atlantis, a lot better. The second of the 3 animated King Kong movies, and also one of the 3 King Kong movies to be based on one of his TV shows. Specifically, the short-lived Kong the Animated Series, which followed a part-human clone of the original Kong and his human brother, Jason, whose DNA was used in the former's creation, as they battled an evil scientist who wanted to revive an ancient fire demon. But don't worry, this movie is a standalone adventure instead of a continuation of the series itself. And while not necessarily better than The Mighty Kong, this movie definitely has a few more things going for it that puts it well above the former. For one, the animation looks a lot better. Not by much, but since it's a part of a TV show, it's understandable. It's a lot more crisp, there's far fewer animation flaws, and so on and so forth. And the story, while just as kid-friendly as The Mighty Kong, was a little bit more interesting as it focused more on Kong questioning his status as king and if he really is one. Plus, it's not like they're slaughtering a classic story that has transcended many generations just to appeal to kids here. That's already an immediate plus. There were a few moments that almost made me chuckle, particularly out of the villain's henchman, Sycophus. And out of all the King Kong movies, this film probably has the highest stakes. And I mean that in an apocalyptic sense. And the final battle is pretty fun too. Plus, there are a lot of interesting creatures that call Atlantis home that makes it visually interesting to look at. Plus, I do find this to be an interesting bit of trivia. This is the first time in any King Kong media that portrays Kong's island not to be his original home, and that he is a creature that originates from underneath the planet. A concept that would be used again in Kong King of the Apes and the Monsterverse respectively. With that said, there are also an equal amount of problems with this film to balance it all out. Unlike most versions of the city, Atlantis and the entire land it inhabits is portrayed as a desert empire instead of an underwater kingdom. While that is definitely an original take on the legendary Lost Empire, because there is nothing but red and brown for miles, this ends up making the entirety of Atlantis, and by default a good chunk of the movie, really unappealing to look at. They force an underdeveloped romance between Jason's friend Tan and this new chick for no real reason, which, yes, is never built up to and leads to nothing. And I really don't care about the conflict between Jason and his other friend Lua. And, much like The Mighty Kong, this is a musical with some pretty cringy songs to boot. But thankfully, unlike the former, they are very few and far between. If I am being honest, I think this would have worked better as a 3-part episode, similar to the Monster Wars storyline in Godzilla the series, as it gives the creators more time to develop the story, the characters, and even the conflict. And yes, anyone who has not seen the series this is based on will definitely be lost at certain parts, particularly the Cyberlink. But as is, there's nothing bad enough to stick out to me, nor anything good enough for me to truly remember. But that's kind of a problem in of itself. Even with how bad the bottom 2 movies were, they could at least be described as anything but forgettable. This movie, on the other hand, is just nothing. Nothing, that is, but a movie that exists. There's nothing annoying, nothing offensive, nothing stellar, nothing mediocre, nothing outstanding. There's just nothing in here to remember for the best or worst reasons. I'm not saying the movie is bad per se, but if I wanted to watch a movie about a big strong guy going to a desert world to fight a corrupt ruler and their loyal minions and monsters to free the people that live there, I'd just watch Planet Hulk. This is a perfectly serviceable children's film, one that'll be just as quickly forgotten as soon as it's over, and one that I'm already starting to forget as we speak.
Looks like Team Rocket's blasting off again!
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
Kong: Return to the Jungle, the third and currently final animated movie based on King Kong, and the second King Kong movie to be based on Kong the Animated Series. So, with that out of the way, let's get the elephant out of the room. This is animated in CGI, and this movie looks horrendous. Like, Hoodwinked and Elf Bowling are looking at this and are laughing at it. Heck, if it weren't for the fact that it's a lot more sophisticated, and I use that term very lightly, I'd say this movie's visuals is on par with something made by Video Brincato. It looks that bad. So much of the movements are stiff, the eyes of the characters are almost always soulless, and the designs from the 2D show do not translate well to 3D at all. And the whole world just looks flat and lifeless with how empty it is. You'd swear humankind just disappeared one day. Which, ironically, lessens the tension this movie is trying to build by having all these prehistoric creatures destroying a New York that's almost entirely abandoned. How is it that this movie has worse looking food effects than frickin' Food Fight? Look at this moment where Chandar is thrown into a table. It's clearly just a ragdoll like in Gary's mod. Look at Teen Kong over here. This is officially my new sleep paralysis demon. Look at him. You know what this reminds me of?
Bring ha.
But maybe I'm being too hard on it. After all, it is animated with state-of-the-art CGI. I mean, come on, what state-of-the-art movie wouldn't use painfully out-of-place GIF explosions in their action scenes? Have objects appear out of nowhere and use ragdoll physics? Truly worthy of the advertisement state-of-the-art. And I know some may say, oh, this is early CGI. No, it's not. This came out 10 years after Jurassic Park. VeggieTales looks better than this. Donkey Kong Country looks better than this. Code Lyoko looks better than this. Yes, the movie was probably made with a TV show budget much like King of Atlantis. But also remember, the year this movie released was the same year Jimmy Neutron wrapped up its run. Another show that came out years before this movie was a TV budget, and it still looks 100 times better. So even by direct-to-video or made-for-TV standards, this movie still looks cheap. As this is technically the series finale for Kong the Animated Series, throughout writing this, I imagined what this film would have been like if it was animated in the same 2D art style as the show it's a part of. And honestly, it would have looked 1,000 times better. In fact, I'm just going to say it. The show, while not the best, is 1,000 times better. Mainly because the animation doesn't want to make me pour bleach in my eyes. I mean, it's no masterpiece, and I'm pretty sure the upcoming Skull Island Netflix series will put all previous King Kong shows to shame. But just watching some of the episodes of the series back to back with this is really painful.
It burns!
While this is far from the worst King Kong movie ever made, this is by far the ugliest out of all of them. It's even worse when you realize this is the movie that followed up the 2005 remake by Peter Jackson. But that's not really a fair comparison, so let's move on. Because there are also a lot of other issues that this movie has. The Foley in this movie is really bad at points. Like in the first fight between Kong and the T-Rex. There's no weight behind any of their attacks because the sound they use sounds more like they're hitting each other with pillows. What happened to Dr. Claw over here? I know he's supposed to have been taken care of, but given how little purpose he has in this plot, you could have just written him out and replaced him with someone else. Heck, his appearance in this film completely contradicts the canon of the show itself, because in his last appearance, he was left in a catatonic state unlikely to ever wake up again. How is he back up and ready to go? Wow, that sure took a lot out of me. With all that said, is there actually anything to like about this movie? Well, I do think that this movie, without a doubt, has the best story out of all 3 animated King Kong movies. But considering its competition, that's not really saying much. The basic plot for this movie is that a descendant from the man who captured the original Kong now wants to capture his clone along with other prehistoric animals under the guise of displaying them in a zoo, when in reality, he wants them to be unleashed onto New York City for the purpose of creating the ultimate big game hunt. Which in some ways, kind of fits with the ideas of the original movie when regarding King Kong being taken to civilization. This movie also fills in a lot of the blanks when it comes to this specific continuity, giving us more backstory to the main scientist lady and her grandson, a fleshed out origin story for Kong, and the events that led to the first Kong being captured and brought to civilization, while working to wrap up most loose ends when it comes to the series, while leaving it open for more potential installments that, as you could guess, never happened. Because of this, anyone going into this movie without prior knowledge of the show may only be a tad lost on some aspects, but it is a lot more friendly to newcomers than what King of Atlantis is, that's for sure. I also think the movie got a little bit better once we got to the third act, and the stakes this movie tries to build, and I stress that a lot, tries, are pretty good. And yes, this is also a musical, and while the songs are generic and just hammer the idea of freedom good and captivity bad a little too much, they are instead played more like the songs are in Tarzan, where it's sung in the background non-diegetically, instead of by the characters themselves. Which honestly fits the film much better when taking into account the series it's based on is not a musical, and as such, it's not as painful to watch as the other films. The designs of the animals look fine for the most part, and the cyber hunters look pretty cool. Trust me, if I were still a kid, I'd totally want those to be toys. I thought the bridge fight was kind of fun, and the loop-de-loop they do is honestly the only time I can say the animation looked sort of decent. And I definitely like that the final battle between Kong and his natural enemy, the T-Rex, doesn't involve him and Jason cyberlinking to beat him. It's just the 2 sworn enemies, settling things on their own terms, once and for all. Of the 3 animated King Kong movies, this might be, in my opinion, the best. Because when ignoring the horrendous animation, it's honestly a pretty decent story and could honestly be a really fun movie for kids, or even the family if you're looking for some quick entertainment. It's still like a 5 out of 10 movie, and if it had only been done in that 2D art style as the series, it could have been a solid high tier 6 out of 10. But hey, at least it's not the mighty Kong. I personally wouldn't watch it again, but if you have a kid who's really dying to see this movie, or who really enjoys King Kong, it won't hurt anyone. In summary, this movie, just like King of Atlantis, is a perfectly serviceable children's film. One that's almost just as forgettable, but at least I'm going to remember parts of this movie, even if it's for the wrong reasons. Which definitely puts it a step up from its predecessor in my books.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. What the shell?
There is no 2 endings. That's just a myth. King Kong wins in both. With that said, though, there are indeed 2 versions of this film. One for the US, which has a lot of edits to make it more palatable for American audiences, and the original Japanese version. And while we will be talking about both versions are just honestly kind of okay. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying both versions are boring, but for the most part, it's just watching flat, uninteresting characters romping about from set to set with some pretty unfunny comedy.
Corns. I don't want to hear about your corns.
But when the monsters are on screen, it does get better, and we do get that fun destruction you'd expect from a Godzilla movie. And the titular fight in the end is definitely the best part of the movie and makes it worth the watch alone. But before we go into this any further, I think we should address the elephant in the room. The Kong suit is really bad. It lacks the expression that the original stop motion model had, and he just looks like he's out of it in every shot. The arm extensions are really distracting, and you can see where the head does not connect to the rest of the suit. I actually think he looks better in the concept art than in the final product. But the one part about this suit that gets me are those Homer Simpson lips. Yeah, I bet you can't unsee that now, can you? Moving on, let's talk about both versions of the film now. The original Japanese version was a satire of the entertainment culture from back then, and how they tried to do all these wild and insane things to get attention. Which is prominent with how the people kidnapping Kong wants him to be the spokesperson for a medicine company. And the runtime is also a little longer, with extra scenes that help further flesh out the story and characters than the US edit does. There's even moments when the soundtrack is completely silent to just let the scene sink in. However, I also feel like there's quite a bit of padding in this movie, like with how long the tribal dance goes for. All it really does is break the pacing, in my opinion. Oh, there's also this really forced environmental message at the end of the movie that is just so disconnected from everything else, it might as well not even exist. For the US release, it does fix some of these problems. Some of the padding is cut down, and I do think the removal of the environmental message was a huge plus. And while I agree with people that the soundtrack from the Japanese edit better sets the mood than the stock music used in the US edit, there's one moment I think works better with the stock music. And that's when Kong surprises Godzilla. For this scene, the original just has one consistent track playing through the entire moment. While the US edit actually changes the music out to build suspense and plays to the surprise. Come to think of it, that's not the only edit that adds something to the movie. One of the most famous scenes from this film, aside from the tree, is from the US edit, where two people talk about why Godzilla and Kong may be rivals, this being an instinctual grudge. While in the Japanese version, we're never given a solid reason as to why they'd fight each other. In my opinion, I think that addition helps to flesh this conflict out a lot better. However, the US edit also introduces a lot of other problems, the most infamous being the news broadcasters. I personally wouldn't mind this so much if it weren't for the fact they cut out a lot of key scenes and replaced them with this. It really just muddles the story, and outside of the one scene, doesn't really add anything substantial to the movie, except by removing key points of character development. In the end, both versions share a lot of similarities, issues, and strengths. Both are dull with a really fun finale, and a few hilarious scenes that's just beautiful to watch. It may be one of the most legendary kaiju films ever made, but spoilers for later on in the list, I think you should watch the newer movie before watching this one. As is, it's a perfectly okay movie that will satisfy your need for an old cheesy monster movie.
I call it bold and bright.
More like belongs in the trash.
Now, I gave King Kong Lives a lot of
Shiitake.
but in truth, its predecessor is actually pretty good. A lot of people seem to really hate this movie, calling it an inferior follow-up to the original. And in many ways, yes it is. But in other ways, I feel like this movie is also underrated. Let's start with the good stuff, because there's quite a bit. While it still has the classic story beats we all know, the story in this movie is genuinely different from the original. This time being a modernized retelling about an oil company coming to Skull Island to harvest its black gold, but deciding to profit off of Kong instead when the crude they find isn't good to use, choosing to be more so a character-driven drama instead of an adventure movie, with certain roles being changed to fit more with this new narrative. Jack is now a primatologist who comes along for the ride to find Kong. Dwan, our Ann Darrell of the movie, is already an actress, just one that never made it, and Fred Wilson, the Carl Denham of sorts, having his desire for money be what drives the whole conflict. So while it's definitely one of those big corporation bad movies that are not subtle about their message, this movie does justify its existence by not being a complete retread of the original film. And while the build-up to Skull Island is really tedious, I don't think it was as bad as people say it is, especially when compared to some of the other movies on this list. And the fact the movie starts off with the voyage setting off helps make the scene feel more like one continuous first act instead of a long, drawn-out second act. I also like that they actually explain why Kong climbs up the tallest building he finds. That being, it resembles his lair back on Skull Island, and he scales it as a way to both feel safe and to assert his dominance. There were also a couple lines that made me chuckle. The first being,
Hey, don't print those. I'm a married man.
Guaranteed the cover of People magazine.
Print just one.
and the other being the scene where Dwan is telling the crew how she survived her ship sinking because the director was screening a movie she didn't like.
Did you ever meet anyone before whose life was saved by Deep Throat?
Not because I thought the line itself, or the delivery, or what the implications of it entailed were funny, but because it was the last thing I'd expect to hear in a King Kong movie. And I do like that Dwan herself doesn't just stand there and scream at the big guy. She actually stands up to Kong's dominance quite a bit, and that's what helps Kong develop a respect for her, and what helps the two to kindle something. And it helps make Kong's fall that much more tragic. And I particularly like what gets King Kong mad enough to escape is him thinking Dwan is in danger instead of it being flashing camera lights. And hey, they actually explain how they were able to bring Kong back to civilization. Something that, heck, I think only Toho ever dared to answer. But let's get to the most standout part of this movie. The costumes and effects were done by Rick Baker, the same guy who did the special effects for films such as Star Wars, Harry and the Hendersons, Mighty Joe Young, An American Werewolf in London, and The Exorcist, just to name a few. And it really shows. The miniatures, the costumes, and the special effects are easily the best part of this movie, with how expressive Kong is, the miniatures and mock buildings look really good. They even reuse the giant hands and feet like in the original movie for similar effects. And yes, out of all the times Kong was portrayed through a man in a suit, this is easily the best looking one out of the bunch. But given its competition, it's really no contest. So yeah, it's not the original, but hot dang, there is a lot to like in this movie. Unfortunately, there is also just as much to not like in this movie. I was honestly kind of surprised they didn't spend some of that $24 million budget on making original sound effects for Kong, and instead opting to use stock roars for him. I know that this movie was very expensive to make at the time, but I'm sorry, whenever I hear this roar, I'm always going to think of,
Run for your lives, everyone! It's the appetizer!
the lack of dinosaurs and prehistoric wildlife really does take away from the magic and wonder of Skull Island, and makes it feel more like any generic jungle you can find in most movies. And do you want to know the reason why they didn't have them in this film? It was because they thought stop motion was too expensive. They happily portrayed Kong in suitmation, but refused to do the same thing for the dinosaurs. Why couldn't they portray the dinosaurs in costumes like King Kong? Other movies were already doing that. Heck, this movie's numerous rip-offs were doing that. So why couldn't they do it here? Speaking of the effects, while Rick Baker does a good job, most of the set designs do not reach that same level of quality, and feels more like a set than an actual location. Which is really embarrassing since the sets of the original and the Toho movies are more convincing. The romance between Dwan and Jack was by the books, and the final battle with the helicopters does go on a bit too long for my taste. Speaking of which, this movie feels really contrived at points. Jack just so happens to know about Kong. The World Trade Center just so happens to look like Kong's lair. They just so happen to have a ship big enough to hold Kong. You get the idea. Which brings us back to Kong and Dwan. While their connection is much stronger here than in the previous King Kong movies we've talked about, this does have its own drawbacks as well. Which leads us to the movie's most infamous scene, where Kong takes Dwan to the waterfalls to wash and dry her off. Though this was meant to be a magical and, in some weird way, wholesome scene, this also came off to a lot of people as creepy and made Kong look more like a pervert. Which, yes, he kind of is.
Get your fat ass back here.
Once again, maybe if there were dinosaurs in this movie, they could have Dwan being attacked by one, but Kong saves her and, seeing how dirty she got during the scuffle, takes her to help clean her off. That would have worked a bit better and alleviate some of that creepiness of the scene. But this isn't the only questionable thing they put in this movie. Like I mentioned already, this film has an environmental message about the evils and corruption of big business. And this underlying message is about as subtle as a gunshot to the foot. When it was first released, I can understand why it was so maligned by the people who saw it, as all of its problems definitely weighed it down. And it didn't help that this was clearly being made to cash in on the popularity of movies like Jaws and The Poseidon Adventure. Actually, here's a fun bit of trivia. There were actually 2 remakes pitched. One that would have been a much more faithful retelling by Hammer Productions, and this one. As you've probably surmised, the Hammer one was never made, but test footage was later reused for a commercial, and a script was released sometime later. By using what we have of this version of King Kong, and the remake those people ended up making instead, it's clear this would have been a much worthier successor to the original movie, unlike this film. However, if you were to distance it away from the original and pretend that movie didn't exist, it's a pretty good monster movie. A pretty clunky monster movie, but it's a big budget B movie with its own charm that changes enough to the story to ensure it's not just a one-to-one remake. Ahem. And I do think its existence is justified on that merit alone. If you like giant monsters or are a fan of King Kong, then this movie is at least worth a watch, at least once. Maybe not the best, but compared to everything below it, I'd take this over some of the other films on this list any day.
10 times as big as a man.
King Kong Escapes is the first King Kong movie to be based on one of his TV shows. But not only that, it's also the last King Kong movie made by Toho before they lost the rights to him. So let's just get right into it. Like the others, it takes a while to get started, but unlike some of these other movies, it's not as boring, as this movie is more interested in keeping you engaged with its cheesy sci-fi nature. It just wants to get you to Kong faster. And it's also one of the few non-MonsterVerse King Kong movies that is not a retelling of the first film. To an extent, of course, but instead of it being the traditional story we all know, this movie is about Kong being kidnapped by a mad scientist, Doctor Who wants to use his strength for evil, only for him to escape and be pursued by his powerful doppelganger, Mechanicon. Speaking of which, much like the last movie, this film was made using suits rather than stop motion, and while they do not look good per se, the Kong suit and puppet looks considerably better than the one in King Kong vs. Godzilla. A definite improvement, though not by much. Also, this movie is the official debut of Gorosaurus, who would go on to star in some of the later Godzilla movies and comics. But let's get to the one monster that you're probably more interested in: Mechanicon. Mechanicon is without a doubt one of the most unique monsters created for the King Kong franchise, and definitely feels like it was written for a Saturday morning cartoon, in the best way possible, and is without a doubt one of his best enemies. It's really no wonder why they brought him back on occasion to fight Godzilla in some of his mangas. And the final battle the two have is really good. It takes place on the Tokyo Tower, and it's essentially them playing a deadly game of King of the Hill on a precariously dangerous set. But let's get to what I think makes the movie work: Doctor Who. While not on the same level as Darth Vader, he is probably the best King Kong villain in any iteration, as he truly is a detestable piece of shit, for all the right villainous reasons. And it's honestly very satisfying to see him get his comeuppance. I cannot say this movie is as boring as the previous one Toho made, as it does prioritize getting straight to the point as fast as possible. But yeah, the part where our heroes are stuck in Doctor Who's base is honestly the dullest part of this movie. And the ending is honestly a bit anticlimactic. Sure, it's cheesy and basic, but that's the charm of it. If you're looking for a popcorn flick to turn your mind off to, then this is the one I recommend. And it might be one I go back to and watch every few years. I wouldn't call it a forgotten classic, but it's a fun feature film for the whole family.
Just think, we'll be among the first people to actually get a tour of Skull Island.
To me personally, Kong Skull Island is one of the best Kong movies made in recent memory, mainly because it is the first King Kong movie that doesn't try to emulate what the original movie did. Sure, one could argue the same thing about King Kong Escapes, but even then, it had to resort to using a lot of plot beats from the original movie. Here, however, this movie makes it very clear that this is not trying to be like Grandpa's King Kong. This is a big budget B movie, and it knows it. It does not take itself too seriously, and it just wants to entertain the audience. As such, this movie has a much faster pace than most other King Kong movies and gets to the meat of the film much quicker. And once it does, it becomes a non-stop action adventure that delivers on the spectacle, with the camera angles and CGI work doing wonders to show just how big these creatures are, and so much more. Speaking of which, a lot of the movie was filmed in Vietnam, so it takes place in real jungles and it fits within the time frame this movie takes place in. The fact this was filmed in a real jungle gives Skull Island a really distinct look from other versions, and it's filled with so much life, both dangerous and docile, that it truly feels like an ecosystem untouched by man. I even like that the main human antagonist wants to destroy Kong not because of him being a one-note bad guy, but because he is someone whose life was defined by war and he has nothing else left to really live for, and finds new motivation and purpose in killing Kong when he presents himself as an enemy. And while the movie definitely pays homage to past King Kong movies, it does it without it ever feeling like a retread. Heck, I even like that they gave the Skull Island natives an actual name. Outside of the Kong of Skull Island books, they've always been called the Skull Islanders. That's a neat change that gives them more of an identity. But let's get to what this movie is really about. Kong. This movie focuses much more on Kong as opposed to the human cast, which is honestly really welcomed after so many movies just doing the same thing over and over again. It gives a deeper look at Kong and what he does and establishes him as a character we'd want to see more of in the future. Unfortunately, that also does come at the cost of the human characters being really bland. Most of them are pretty underdeveloped or have no real purpose other than dying. John C. Reilly was kind of wasted, but at least he wasn't as wasted as Bryan Cranston in Godzilla. I don't think there was really any character I could truly say was fun or entertaining. Okay, scratch that. Hank Marlowe, Wild Flat, is honestly a really fun character, and you do sympathize with him just wanting to go home. In any case, this was the breath of fresh air this franchise desperately needed. And I'm willing to bet now that Kong is freed from the tragic fate of his predecessors, we will be seeing more of him for a long time to come. I know some people don't like this movie since it doesn't meet the standards or expectations that come with the King Kong name, but I think this list has made it pretty clear there was never a standard to begin with. Regardless, this is a really good start for this new take on the King Kong mythos. One that is truly untethered to the legacy of the original film. And this is the movie that truly made me a King Kong fan. Also, Brie Larson was far better here than as Captain Marvel. Is that what you wanted to hear? Are you happy now?
Let them fight.
Right off the bat, this movie is a major improvement over the original film. But is that really a surprise to anyone? And trust me when I say this, there really is a lot to like in this movie. For one, they actually give us a clear-cut winner, but also find a way of making both characters look good by the end. Godzilla wins the titular fight, but Kong wins the final battle. It's a good middle ground as it doesn't bring down either character and paints them in a much better light than just having one stay down. And much like the last movie, it does a really great job at showing you the size of these creatures, with a lot of these shots feeling more like Renaissance paintings at times. But let's get down to what everyone was really looking for in this film, the kaiju-sized action. It's great. The fight at the Tasman Sea is easily the best scene in the movie and has without a doubt become the most iconic moment from it. With good reason, as this is where the action peaks in my opinion, as it's both the most intense scene in the movie and it's the scene where you can tell the writers had the most fun making. Not to say the other fight scenes aren't fun either, the Hong Kong fight is definitely a close second. And while it does take place at night, unlike the previous MonsterVerse movies, it's actually well lit with the neon lights of the buildings illuminating everything on screen. But that's not the only thing that makes this movie great. The Hollow Earth, while not explored in depth, is a really cool place and the most unique location in either franchise, with its weird gravity, endemic fauna, vast landscapes above and below, and the few new monsters we see are ones I hope we get to see more of in the future. And let's not forget the Royal Axe. Similar to the lightning powers in the original movie, this was made to be Kong's counter to Godzilla's atomic breath, and it truly is a weapon that complements Kong really, really well. Dollars to donuts, 10 years from now, when people think of King Kong, they're going to think of him with the Royal Axe. And hey, speaking of Kong, he is a really likable character in this. He's a tired old man who just wants to settle down, but is thrust into a situation with no choice of his own. How is that not relatable? And when Godzilla is on screen, he's a lot of fun to watch, and it's cool to see him somewhat go back to his destructive roots. I love the scene where Gia and her guardian are speaking to each other through sign language because it leads to a great reveal of Kong using sign language himself. And the fact that it's implied he understood their entire conversation is just the cherry on top. Speaking of which, I think Gia is one of the most interesting characters in the King Kong mythos. She takes the place that's been held by characters like Anduan and even to an extent, Lua. But the connection she and Kong has is updated to be more like a child and a guardian as opposed to the classic tale of Beauty and the Beast we're all too familiar with. And the fact that she is deaf leads to some pretty cool scenes, like when she senses Godzilla's presence through vibrations in the ship's hull. And I really like Kong's roars in this movie. They're actually very distinct and sound like they belong to an animal as powerful as Kong would be. Similar to the Royal Axe, I am also willing to bet when people think of King Kong, it will be with this thunderous bellow and not the animal growls or stalked roars of yesteryear. But with all that said, this finally leads us to the problems I have with this movie. There's not as much screen time for Godzilla, so I felt really disappointed in that regard. But in truth, this is really more of a King Kong movie, so that's understandable. The whole subplot with Madison and her friends is honestly pretty tedious and doesn't really do much for the story. The human cast is once again pretty bland, and I honestly don't think we're given enough reasons to see why Mechagodzilla is a bad thing. I mean, I agree with this guy. Why shouldn't we have a weapon to protect ourselves from these things? I think the next time a Ghidorah shows up, having a mecha around wouldn't be a bad thing. Also, doesn't Apex having the Ghidorah skull defeat the point of the villain from the last movie getting it? I know he sold it to Apex in the novelization, but I think that should have been established in the movie itself and not a novelization after the fact. And the technology in this movie, while cool, is also kind of absurd within the context of all these movies put together. Remember, chronologically speaking, this movie takes place 7 years after Gareth Edwards' Godzilla, a film that was grounded in realism and only had technology as advanced as what we currently had back then. Now the world's basically become Wakanda, with flying anti-gravity cars, building-sized mechs, psychic brain devices, the ability to scan elements from one location to another. The fact that they were able to create these revolutionary devices all within a decade means that they've either achieved world peace and now pool all the resources the world has to offer into making these things, or they found a way to create those funds needed through some more lucrative means. And, for as cool as the team up between Godzilla and Kong is, it feels a bit forced in the sense that Kong automatically accepts Godzilla's not the enemy, after all the latter did was attack him and destroy his home. But with that said, this may not be my favorite of the King Kong movies, but it's the one I'm probably the most passionate about. Honestly, with how the MCU has been going, what are you going to get out of She-Hulk that you can't get here? And hey, while this is connected to previous movies, this stands pretty well on its own, and prior viewing of previous MonsterVerse entries is not required. This is far from a perfect movie, but this is definitely a must-watch for fans of both monsters, and people who just want to have a fun time in general. This is a movie that knows what it is and what the audience wants, and delivers full-heartedly. And honestly, what more could you ask for?
Wait a minute!
The gamers say we're retro, which I think means old but cool.
This is probably the best written King Kong movie ever made.
Hey, wait a minute.
Yes, I admit that, objectively speaking, this is probably the best movie overall. But given how many times this has been remade, reimagined, parodied, and ripped off, the magic of this movie has just dwindled down for me. I'm not saying it's a bad movie, but I feel like this film is kind of overrated in some aspects. Okay, let me explain. This is the best written movie overall, with near airtight writing with very little filler or padding, with the exception of the boat ride. But when we do get to Skull Island, that's when it truly starts to shine. The sense of danger and mystery this movie builds still gives it a sense of adventure and scale that most of the other movies released around the time, and even on this list if I'm being frank, sadly lack. And despite its age, the stop motion is still nice to look at, and it gives this movie an old-timey feel that makes it very charming to watch. It's really cool to go back to this and think, this is what paved the path for the standards and special effects we have today. The rampage sequence and final battle on the Empire State Building are still some of the best in this, let's be honest, mediocre batch of films. And while it does take a long time to get to the meat of the story, but since it's not as long as in some of these other movies, and it is meant to build tension, it's honestly passable. But I also don't think we spend enough time exploring Skull Island and seeing the creatures that live there either. I also think this movie's Ann Darrell is probably the worst version of the character in any of these movies.
Thelonious... You were saying?
What I mean is, she doesn't add anything substantial to the plot outside of being the damsel in distress. Which, don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those woke weirdos on Twitter that says every girl character has to be like Captain Marvel at all times and make the men bow to her. But come on, Anne's constant screaming really gets on the nerves after a while. Like, can you shut up for a few moments, please?
Can't take it anymore!
I've eaten things that didn't complain as much.
Kind of like my mom when it comes to the kids in Jurassic Park. I don't care if she's rescued or not. I just want the dinosaurs to eat her already so she'd stop bellowing. And out of all the King Kong movies, I think this movie has the least sympathetic Kong out of them all. I say this because, while I will admit Kong being seen as this tragic beast who was wrongfully slain does fit him to an extent here, it really is misplaced. Why? Because he's the antagonist.
What? What?
Yeah, while Denham may be the one to capture him, he's more so the driving force that keeps the plot moving. And while the natives do kidnap Anne, they only do it to appease their god, a god that they fear. And you already know who that god is. King Kong. Kong is the active threat throughout the movie. He's the one chasing and killing our heroes unprovoked. He's the one that's attacking innocent people. He's the one that tears up half of New York. I know in most of his portrayals, he almost racks up a body count of some sort, but in most of those movies, he kills people because they've either provoked him into fighting back, or through a simple mistake. That's not the case here, but the one scene that showed me Kong was never intended to be that sympathetic is the scene where he begins to undress Anne and fondles with her rump roast. And no, this wasn't a scene made for the '76 remake like a lot of people seem to think. That was in the original movie. I mean, both of these scenes are self-censored, but this just cements Kong's status as one of cinema's most tragic characters as kind of being misplaced, at least with this version. No. The real tragedy of Kong is not him dying at the hands of man. It's the tragedy he causes because of one man's greedy ambitions. I mean, going back to the '76 film real quick, while he does pop the top off, the moment Dwan makes it clear she does not approve, Kong obliges and puts her down. He clearly respects her enough to respect her wishes. Here, on the other hand, if Jack didn't show up to save her, Kong would have happily gone beyond just scratching and sniffing and straight up monkey around with her.
Mwah! Good night, everybody.
I know I've probably convinced a lot of people to think I hate this movie, but I don't. I really do like it. I just don't think it's the magnum opus many people paint it out to be. I just think it's a fun, well-written movie that has problems that hold it back from being the best. At least for me. In the end, this is just the kind of movie that was so influential that no film that came out after it could ever live up to it. And yet, somehow, one movie didn't just live up to its legacy, but also surpassed it. Going into this video, I knew this was probably going to place up pretty high on the list, but I never expected it to place this high. But man, this movie was masterful. I know this may be a controversial pick for some, but I'm sorry. Just because something's a classic, that doesn't make it the superior version. Everything in this movie tells you that this was Jackson's passion project, and while it may be the same story as the first, he also went that extra step, fleshing out more of the story and world to create something truly magnificent. Actually, let's talk about that. The world in this movie really sucks you in, and captures the time period pretty well. You really feel like you're in the Great Depression. And while the CGI does look dated, much like the stop motion used in the original, the CGI techniques used here were also groundbreaking for the time. And to be fair, the CGI still does look pretty good. And it does what a remake should. It fixes a lot of the problems the original movie had. I like how Anne and Kong actually have to develop their relationship over the course of the film, and it really does this entire plot point its due justice. Anne is able to befriend Kong by entertaining him with her acting skills, making her being an actress have actual relevance to the story. And the longer the two spend time with each other, their connection grows more and more. And I do think it makes Kong's final fall that much more tragic. Kong himself also has a very distinct, likable personality that is expressed very well by Andy Serkis. And while Jack Black is an odd choice for Carl Denham, he surprisingly fits this movie's interpretation of him pretty well. It's basically the same as Robert Armstrong's character, but a little more exaggerated. Like, there's moments where you're left wondering if this guy cares about his footage more than his men, or if it's the other way around. And Skull Island has never felt this lush or as dangerous as in this movie, with dangers both big and small around every corner. While the MonsterVerse Skull Island has a better aesthetic, this place truly feels like what the people watching King Kong for the first time envision it as. And I love the visual storytelling here. Like the moment we go into Kong's cave and see the skeletons of his people, implying he is the last of his kind. I love little details like that. And that spider pit scene. That's just terrifying, and is without a doubt the most scary scene in any King Kong movie. And just how cool was that fight between Kong and the V-Rex? I like how it's set up like a boss fight from a video game, where each time Kong defeats one, the layout and the rules of the fight changes. It even ups the ante by having Anne be in the middle of the fight as Kong juggles her between the snapping jaws of the 3 dinosaurs. The scene from the original movie will always be the most iconic, but man, this just blows it out of the water. Yes, it has its problems. Yes, it has a grueling runtime with plenty of filler. Yes, the romance between Anne and Jack, while more developed here, is still a love at first sight sort of thing. Yes, it has some out-of-place goofy moments that kill the tone.
The most spectacular thing you've ever seen. That's where I'll shoot my picture. Will there be boobies? Boobies?
While these flaws do hold it back from being a true masterpiece to me, what it does right, it does right. While the 1933 film will always be the one movie people think of and go back to, in my humble opinion, Peter Jackson's King Kong is without a doubt the best King Kong movie ever made. And that is the long and very mixed line of King Kong movies. And honestly, I think it's safe to say, outside of a few films, it's not worth it to find and watch them all. I mean, it's not a bad franchise, but it's definitely not worth going out of your way for. In the end, outside of a few films, it's pretty understandable why Kong never took off like how Godzilla, Gamera, or even other monsters had for the longest time. But by the way things look right now, it appears Kong has finally caught a break and is now slowly leaving the shadow of his original movie behind, focusing more on doing its own thing as opposed to what's been done before, which, let's be honest, is pretty welcomed. Kong is one of those characters who truly deserves to be recognized for a lot more than just one movie. And while the past may be bleak, the future does look bright. And I know that by making this list, I am now obligated to talk about the Godzilla movies, and probably the Gamera movies at some point. But for now, I give the King Kong franchise, as a whole, a 6 out of 10. A few movies I'd watch again, but not enough to rank it any higher. But what do you think of the King Kong franchise? Do you think it's all good, or do you think only the first movie is worth watching? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for all my future content. Until then, I will see you guys later.